Hi everyone, I'm Maggie McGrath with Forbes Breaking News. Rapper Sean Diddy Combs was arrested in New York City on Monday, and today, Tuesday, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York unsealed the charges against Combs, and they include trafficking and racketeering and more. Here to break this down for us is Lauren Johnson Norris. She is a criminal defense lawyer and the founder of the Johnson Criminal Law Group. Lauren, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start broad. How did we get here? What is the background and the context we all need to know to understand this case?
Well, over the last almost 2 decades, Sean Combs appears to have been involved in a criminal enterprise, bringing women to parties and using force and violence and guns to not only benefit himself, but as part of his business model. We saw in the last couple years that lawsuits have been filed, and I think it's that window that New York opened for civil lawsuits in 2023 that really brought in the floodgates of allegations against him. We started hearing rumors about his proclivities and sort of his behavior over the years, but it was only until these lawsuits were filed that multiple alleged victims came forward. Many of those cases were settled, but I think those facts are underlying what's being criminally prosecuted here.
Interesting. So it took those victims coming forward basically for the law to build a case against him and then arrest him yesterday and unseal the charges today. Is that correct?
It is. And what's interesting is New York opened a period of time for people to file old claims that might have otherwise been excluded under the statute of limitations. And when they opened that window, these lawsuits came in alleging conduct from over a decade ago, though it appears that Combs was involved from 2008 until even last year, some of the conduct that's been alleged. But yeah, I think it was that window and those civil suits that brought the U.S. attorney the evidence that they needed.
So let's break down the charges. The U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York unsealed 3 big charges today. What are they? What do we need to know about them?
So the first allegation is that there's a criminal enterprise. And what that means is that Combs used his business to conduct illegal activities. And when we hear that with a conspiracy, that means that there were other people involved. Though he's the only person that's been charged at this time, I know the Department of Justice is saying that perhaps there will be others. They can't commit at this point. The investigation is ongoing. But there's also allegations that involve sex trafficking and using violence in order to compel people to commit acts of sex at his force and coercion, using violence and threats and even arson. And that obviously is something that is precluded by law. Then they also allege racketeering, and that also relates to, under the RICO statute, to the conspiracy. They're allowed to bring these charges under that statute as well. So all of this appears to have been a criminal enterprise using force and violence, drugging, arson, and other criminal acts to get people to be trafficked.
I was going to say, you mentioned RICO, which I feel like we normally hear about in a business context and not in a sexual violence context. But what we have here, just to zoom out a little bit, is not just sexual violence, but allegations of a business around sexual violence.
That's what it sounds like. Sometimes when we think of RICO, we think of mobsters or other, in a financial setting, but it looks like here they're using the statute as a way to look at this enterprise being one of trafficking, human trafficking.
And I know it's still early in the legal proceedings here, but what is the punishment that Sean Diddy Combs faces for these charges if he were to be convicted?
Sure. The most serious punishment that exposes him to life is using sexual assault or violence or force on someone who's being trafficked. And so ultimately, these charges could result in him facing a life sentence.
A life sentence in prison. Wow.
Well, that's correct. Yeah. I mean, the course of conduct over a decade with multiple victims and the level and scale of violence used to commit these crimes is under the code allows that.
Now, there was some reporting that emerged today from TMZ that the feds intended to arrest Combs today on Tuesday, but instead moved up the arrest by a day to yesterday based on some new information. What does that suggest to you as an attorney with experience in criminal defense? Does this signal that he was perhaps going to escape?
Well, that's certainly the question I think that folks would ask. And having looked at the detention letter that Justice sent over to the court asking for him to be detained, it certainly appears that there are elements of flight risk that are at issue here. We also see that they allege that he may be dissuading witnesses and obstructing the case. And so whenever that's happening, the government's going to want to curtail that and make sure that this person can't harm their case any further than they may have already done.
You say obstruct, so could there be additional charges for obstruction of justice?
Well, it appears that there can be, and what they've alleged in the detention letter is that Combs has already contacted witnesses and victims and made an effort to dissuade them from testifying, providing them with false narratives. So if they can prove that, and there's evidence to support that, potentially additional charges could be filed.
So the arrest was yesterday. The unsealing of the charges was today. What happens next? Will there be a trial? And if so, when?
Well, first he will face the court, and the question about whether or not he'll be detained will be at issue. So that's where that memo came into play. Will he be in custody while this case is pending, or will the court allow him to remain out of custody with conditions? And then there's a large process of exchanging evidence and looking at the evidence that the court has. The defense's job is to evaluate all of that, to interview witnesses, and put together its defense, whatever that might be in this case. Potentially, a case like this could involve a settlement or a trial. It really depends on what the government's willing to offer, and really the strength of their case, which at this point it seems strong, but also what the really, quite frankly, the message will be to the community and the world about this kind of conduct. Will he be an example for others?
Based on what we've seen so far, what's your tea leave reading? Is the government going to make an example of him and really come down hard, push for a trial versus a settlement?
Well, I just don't see how he avoids a trial when he's facing so much time. If they were to offer him something other than a life sentence, potentially, but what he's looking at in the conduct is so egregious and it's so serious that he may be forced to go to trial. At the same time, it's hard for me to say. We haven't seen all of the evidence yet. What's been offered is not necessarily proven, but what the government thinks that it will be able to prove.
Now, in the attorney's press conference today, there was a phrase used a number of times, at least 3 by my count, freak off. And that is not something that feels like a traditional legal term. Have you heard it before, or is that unique to this case?
Well, that's definitely not a legal term. So my reading of the references to the freak off was something that Combs created. It was some kind of sexual event where women who were coerced or sex trafficked were forced to engage in sexual conduct with male sex workers, sometimes being drugged, sometimes under the threat of violence. And violence and drugs were used to coerce people to stay. If they weren't participating in those acts, they were threatened, and not just through threat or violence, but really ruining their entire potential career if they were somebody who thought that they could be in the music industry. And we have to put it in a context where Sean Combs was an incredibly powerful and influential professional in the music industry. And so people felt compelled to participate in whatever he wanted so that they could have a shot. So quite frankly, it seems like the freak off, certainly nothing I've ever heard in the law, something that he constructed and coined the term, and now that's being repeated everywhere.
That's interesting. So what we have here are allegations spanning a number of years. And as you correctly summarized at the top of this conversation, the building of the case took time. So as you look forward, Lauren, how long could this stretch out? Are we going to see this in the headlines and these legal proceedings take weeks, months, years? Or what's the typical timeline in a case like this?
Well, on average, we see that federal cases sentencing occurs about 2 years after an indictment is brought. So I would say you're going to see periods where you hear absolutely nothing, and then there'll be some movement because there will be a court proceeding or some type of evidentiary hearing. Eventually, we'll learn about whether there's a trial. And when there is a trial, I'm sure that that will be top of the news.
I was going to say, if there is a trial, Sean Diddy Combs has a number of celebrity associates, and could any of those celebrity associates be compelled to testify?
Well, absolutely. So it does seem like there was an involvement of many music industry professionals, rappers, and artists, and who may be victims in the case, who may be witnesses in the case, or other collateral witnesses who may be brought in to support the government's case. We can also see that potentially Combs could bring in defense witnesses. That was his world. It was a world of celebrities and rappers and R&B artists, and so those are the people who are going to set the stage and the context for everything that occurred.
As you zoom out, does this indictment, does this arrest say anything to you about where we are in this moment in time, either in a what is often called a post-Me Too society or where we are in this political cycle? Are there societal or cultural implications that you're taking from this moment?
I think the cultural implications are huge. I think the level and scale of violence against women that is alleged in this case is really extraordinary. We don't see that in the law, and I think that is really important to reflect on at this time. If New York hadn't opened up that year of bringing cases where they may have been outside statute of limitations in a civil context to allow victims to tell their stories and to seek redress for their harms, I don't think we'd be at this place today. And so we are seeing legislatures make those types of moves because we are all recognizing that many of those stories have gone untold. As more and more victims come forward and tell those stories, I think we will see really a reformation of the law that listens to women, that takes their concerns and their grievances seriously, and seeks justice for those who are harmed.
I'm curious because we've been talking about, obviously, it's the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York that unsealed the charges today. Could we see Sean Diddy Combs indicted in other jurisdictions, like in California, for instance?
Well, I mean, he did have a residence or does have a residence in California. I understand he also has one in Florida. So it is possible that he could face other charges in other jurisdictions. Whether the government decides to do that strategically or if those cases also could be brought in New York is to be seen. But I think it's entirely possible if that conduct was occurring in other states.
We've covered a lot of ground. Is there anything else that is important to understand about the case against Sean Diddy Combs at this point in time based on what we know?
Well, I think we have a person who was absolutely at the top of their game at one point in time, was really such an influential and important sort of Weinstein-esque figure in the music industry. And to see that we look back and over the last 15 years see that potentially he used such extreme force and violence against women and those in his world around him is really alarming and just cause for concern and calls for a moment of reflection on how celebrity can lead to this kind of thing.
Lauren Johnson Norris, thank you so much for joining us. We so appreciate your insight here.
Glad to be here. Thanks so much.